34 inches, 28 pounds, 40th percentile. That is a 2-year-old boy, written down by a nurse who has done it 9,000 times. 39 inches, 36 pounds, 41st percentile. That is 4. 46 inches, 50 pounds, 43rd percentile. That is 7. And the line on the chart is the most boring line in medicine, and boring is the whole point. A growth curve is supposed to be a promise that nothing is happening. Every year the pencil goes a little higher and a little to the right, and a mother says he's eating me out of house and home, and everybody laughs, and the visit is over in 11 minutes. Now look at year 8. Look at year 9. The line does not fall. That is what people expect me to say, and it is not what happened. The line just stops climbing the way it had climbed for 8 straight years, and it flattens, politely, like a man lowering his voice in a room where somebody is sleeping. Nobody notices a polite line. Not a father, not a teacher, not a coach. One pediatrician noticed. She had drawn every dot on that chart herself since the day the boy was born, and at his 10-year checkup, she stopped talking in the middle of a sentence, and what she did next cost her a career she had spent 26 years building. I'm Nathan. What I want you to take out of the next hour is small, and it is ugly, and it will stay with you. The most dangerous records in your life are not the ones that scream. They're the ones that go quiet. Learn to read a flat line. Bryan Galbraith made his living inside rooms that were not supposed to have weather. That is the shortest, honest way to say what he did. If you walked past his van in Belvoir, Indiana, you would read Galbraith and read controlled environments on the door, and you would assume heating and air. And you would be wrong in a way that would have amused him for about 4 seconds before he went back to work. Bryan certified clean spaces, compounding pharmacies, vaccine storage, tissue banks, the little windowless rooms behind hospital corridors where the air has to be cleaner than. The air outside and the cold has to be exactly the cold it says it is on the label, forever, without 1 hour of argument. He was a validation technician, and what that means in plain language is that he was the man whose signature said a room told the truth. He put smoke into a hood and filmed which way it curled. He set out particle counters and let them count for an hour while he sat on an overturned bucket eating a sandwich. He mapped freezers with 9 calibrated probes, corner to corner and top to bottom, because the middle of a freezer and the back left corner of a freezer are not the same freezer, and every honest person in that industry knows it. He wrote reports nobody read. He hung a sticker on a door with a date on it, and the date meant that on that day, a person named Bryan Galbraith had personally proven that this box was cold all the way through. He was 41. He had a bad shoulder from a rooftop unit in 2019, and a habit of lining pens up parallel to the edge of a table, and a partner named Ben Red, who did the sales because Bryan was physically incapable of pretending to like anyone. He also had a son. Jack Galbraith was 10 years old in the spring this story starts, and he was the kind of 10 that makes strangers in checkout lines say something. Big, serious eyes, a way of listening to adults with his whole head tilted, like he was checking their work. He collected bottle caps, not because he liked bottle caps, but because he had decided at 7 that a person should collect something, and bottle caps were free. Bryan thought that was the single funniest and most respectable reason for a hobby he had ever heard. Jack had been a tired kid for about 2 years. Everyone had an explanation. He'd grown. He was on a screen too much. He was a worrier. He had low iron, which is a thing people say when they want to say nothing at all. He came home from school and lay on the good rug in the front room with his shoes still on, and Bryan would nudge his foot and say, "Hey, buddy, shoes." And Jack would say, "Sorry, Dad," in a voice like a man apologizing for a car accident. Claudia Galbraith had an explanation too. Claudia always did. Bryan had married Claudia Wendover 11 years earlier, and the Wendovers were one of those Belvoir families that were not rich, but were extremely good at being seen near rich people. Her father had sold insurance. Her mother had done church flowers for the kind of funerals that got a photographer. Claudia had grown up in a house where the front room furniture was nicer than the back room furniture, and you did not sit in the front room. She was quick, she was funny at parties, and she carried a specific and permanent hunger that Bryan had mistaken for ambition when he was 30 and had correctly identified as something else by 38. For the last 3 years, she had been working at what she called a clinic. She did intake. She was vague about it in the way people are vague about a job they think is a step down or a step sideways. And Bryan, who did not care about status, had never pushed. She had gotten a new car in October. She had started doing her hair in a way that took 90 minutes. She had stopped asking him about his day, which he noticed, and had stopped complaining about him not asking about hers, which he noticed more, because complaining is a kind of investment, and she had stopped making it. And on Tuesdays and Thursdays, at 6:40 in the morning, Claudia took Jack to swim. That was the routine. It had been the routine since Jack was 6. Belvoir Rec had an early program, and Claudia had signed him up, and she drove him, and Bryan, who was usually 30 miles away by 6:40, because clean rooms get validated when the building is empty, had thanked her for it more than once. He had bought the boy 3 sets of goggles over 4 years and never once asked to see him swim, because the sessions were at 6:40 in the morning and he was a working man, and that is the smallest, most ordinary, most bottomless regret in this entire story. Jack could not swim. Not really. Not the way a kid who has been in a pool twice a week for 4 years can swim. Bryan had noticed that at a lake in July and had made a joke about it, and Claudia had said the program was more about water safety than technique, and Bryan had said, huh, and that was the end of it, because that is what a marriage is at year 10, a series of small huhs that you file and never open. There was one other fixture in the Galbraith family's life, and she is the reason there is a story at all. Dr. Teresa Nesbitt had been Jack's pediatrician since the day he was discharged from the hospital, 7 pounds 1 ounce, with a bruised-looking little head. She was 58 now. She ran a 4-room practice on Kessel Street with a mural of a hot air balloon that had been repainted twice and a fish tank that a local man serviced for free because she had gotten his daughter through a febrile seizure in 2011. She was not warm exactly. She was precise. She was the kind of doctor who wrote her own notes with a fountain pen before she typed them, and who could tell you the birth weight of any child in her practice without looking, and who had, twice in her career, gotten into public fights with hospital administrators and won. She had drawn every dot on Jack Galbraith's growth chart with her own hand. In late March, the reminder card came for Jack's 10-year well-child visit, and Claudia said she'd take him, and then the appointment got moved. Then it got moved again. Then it got moved to a Thursday, and Claudia said she couldn't do Thursday, and Bryan said, fine, I'll take him. And Claudia said, a half second too fast. No, I'll reschedule it. Bryan looked up from the table. He would think about that half second for the rest of his life. Not because it told him anything. It told him nothing. A half second is nothing. But because it was the first crack he could point to and say, there, that's where I could have started. He said, Claude, he's 10. He's tired all the time. Let's just get it done. And she said, fine. And she said it in the voice of a woman agreeing to a thing she had already decided to prevent. And on the 12th of April, at 3:15 in the afternoon, Bryan Galbraith drove his son to Kessel Street because Claudia had a work thing, and she would meet them there, and she would be sitting in the waiting room with a magazine open on her knee for the entire appointment. She never once looked at her phone. Bryan remembered that later, too. That was the tell. She wasn't distracted. She was waiting. The exam room had that mural in it, the hot air balloon, and a poster of the food groups from an era when the food groups were different, and a scale that Bryan looked at with professional interest for about 4 seconds because he could not help himself. 49 and a quarter, the nurse said. 61 pounds even. Her name was Kaylee, and Bryan knew her, the way you know people in a town of 19,000. Which is to say, he knew her last name was Wendover, and that she was some flavor of Claudia's cousin, and that they had all been at the same 4th of July twice. She was pleasant. She was efficient. She wrote the numbers on a card, and she did not write them into the computer while Bryan was watching. And Bryan did not notice that either, because there is no reason on earth for a man to notice that. Dr. Nesbitt came in 8 minutes later with her hands still damp. Jack Galbraith, she said, 10 years old. Would you look at that? It was a good visit for the first 6 minutes. She asked him about school, and he said it was fine, and she said that's a coward's answer, and he laughed. She asked what he collected now, and he said bottle caps, still, and she said good, stick with a thing. She looked in his ears and his throat. She listened to his chest in 4 places and then in a 5th. She had him hop on 1 foot. Then she asked him to lie back, and she put her hands on his belly, and Bryan watched a woman he had known for a decade stop being a person and become an instrument. She palpated his liver edge. She went back over it. She moved to his neck and worked her thumbs down either side of his throat and stayed there about 4 seconds too long. She asked Jack to turn onto his side, and she pulled the waistband of his shorts down 2 inches on the left hip, and she looked at his skin without touching it. Bryan said, "Everything okay?" Dr. Nesbitt said, which is not a word. She had Jack sit up. She asked him to hold his arms out straight in front of him, palms down, and she watched his fingers. Then she asked him, in exactly the same friendly voice she had used about bottle caps, whether the shots ever made his legs sore. And Jack said, "Only the ones in the other place." There is a particular silence that happens when a child answers a question nobody has asked him. Bryan heard it. He heard the fish tank in the hallway. He heard someone's phone in the waiting room. He heard Dr. Nesbitt breathe out through her nose, once, very slowly, like a person setting down a glass. She said, "The other place, okay." She stood up. She went to her stool and rolled it 4 feet to the counter, and she moved her mouse, and she read something on the monitor with her face completely, deliberately empty, and Bryan Galbraith, who spent his professional life reading gauges, understood that he was watching a needle move. Then she turned around and said, "Kaylee, would you go and pull the Halverson file for me? The paper one. It's in the annex." Kaylee Wendover said, "The annex is—" "I know where it is," Dr. Nesbitt said. "Thank you." The door closed. Dr. Nesbitt did not move for a moment. Then she crossed the room, and she did something that Bryan had never seen a doctor do in his life. She pushed the little steel doorstop wedge under the door with the side of her shoe. "Mr. Galbraith," she said, and her voice had changed completely. It had gone flat and fast and low. "Is your wife in the waiting room?" Bryan said, "Yes." "Why? Is she alone?" "Yes." Dr. Nesbitt looked at Jack, and she smiled at him, and it was a real smile. And Bryan would remember that she found the strength to make it real. Then she said, "Jack, would you do me a favor and count the balloons on that mural?" "There are more than you think." Jack said, "There's 6. "There are 11, she said. "Count again." He turned around. She stepped in close to Bryan, and she said quietly, "Listen to me carefully. You and your son are going to leave through the staff exit. Down the hall, past the fire panel, the door with the bar on it. It comes out on Ivy. Do not go back through the waiting room." Bryan said, "What?" "I will tell her the appointment is running long. I will tell her I'm doing blood work, and it's a mess, and it'll be another 40 minutes. She will sit there. She will sit there because she has sat there before." Dr. Nesbitt's jaw moved. "I can't explain it to you here. It's horrible. It's worse than you are currently able to imagine. And if I say it out loud in this building, I will be wrong about the one thing I cannot afford to be wrong about. Do as I say." Bryan Galbraith had been raised by a man who did not take orders well, and he had spent 20 years in an industry where the entire job is refusing to sign things. Every instinct he had said, "Stop, slow down, explain." He looked at her hands. They were shaking. He said, "Show me something, one thing, then we go." And Dr. Teresa Nesbitt, who had 22 months left on a medical license she was about to spend like cash, said, "Yes, all right, one thing." She turned the monitor. What Bryan Galbraith saw on that monitor was not a photograph, and it was not a message, and it was not anything a television show would have chosen. It was a table. Gray header row, white rows below. The ugliest possible font. It was the state prescription monitoring database. And at the top of it, in the patient field, it said Galbraith, Jack T. And under it, a date of birth that was his son's date of birth. And under that, 31 rows. 31 dispensing events, going back 4 years and 2 months. The drug name in every row was the same, and it was not a drug Bryan had ever heard of. A string of letters and a number that looked like a part code. The quantity column said things like 4 and 8 and 4 and 4. The prescriber column said the same name in every single row, Ormond, I, MD. And the dispensing location column, the field that is supposed to say the name of a pharmacy, a Walgreens on a corner, a hospital outpatient window, said, in every one of those 31 rows, the same 11 words. Granville Elam She, Health OFC, Satellite, INV. Alder Point, PPR. Bryan read it 4 times. The room got very small and very loud. His son's school. The health office at his son's elementary school. His son had been receiving something for 4 years, from a doctor he had never met, in a room 140 feet from his own classroom. And every single one of those events had been logged in a state database that a father is not given a login to. Then Dr. Nesbitt moved the mouse and scrolled to the bottom of the table, to row 32, which was not gray like the others, but a pale washed yellow. Row 32 had a status field, and the status field said scheduled. The date on it was the next morning. The time on it was 7:40 a.m. That is tomorrow, Dr. Nesbitt said. That is before homeroom. That is why you are leaving through the staff exit. Bryan Galbraith did not shout. People always think they will shout. What he actually did was reach over and take his son's jacket off the back of the chair and fold it once over his arm, because his hands needed a job. Then he said, "Jack, hey, we're going out the back way. There's a fire panel out there I want to show you." Jack said, "Is it the kind with the glass?" "It's the kind with the glass." At the door, Dr. Nesbitt caught his sleeve. She said one more thing, and it was the sentence that organized the next 11 months of his life. She said, "Mr. Galbraith, I am going to be told that I imagined this. Whatever you do next, do not build it out of what I said. Build it out of what is written down." The staff exit came out on Ivy Street, between a dumpster and a lilac that needed cutting back. It was 4:02 in the afternoon, and the light was completely normal. Bryan put his son in the truck and drove 9 blocks and pulled into the lot behind the hardware store and sat there with the engine off. Jack said, "Am I in trouble?" "No." "Is Mom coming?" "Not right now." Jack accepted that with the terrible easy trust of a 10-year-old, and then he said, into the quiet, "Are we not doing the shots anymore?" Bryan turned in his seat. He had 100 questions, and every one of them was a bad question, and he knew it, because he had spent his whole career learning not to lead a witness. A hood either passes or it doesn't, and if you want it to pass, you will find a way to make it pass, and that is how people die. So he asked the worst-sounding, flattest, most useless question he could think of, which was the only correct one. "Tell me about the other place," and Jack told him. The other place was the nurse's room, but the back half of it, past the curtain, where Mrs. Pickering kept the little white refrigerator with the lock on the front. Twice a month, on a Tuesday or a Thursday, before school, his mom dropped him early, and Mrs. Pickering was already there with the light on, and a man came sometimes, and sometimes it was just Mrs. Pickering. There was a clipboard with his picture on it. He had to blow into a tube and squeeze a thing that had a needle and a spring, and then the shot, and it went in his leg, and they took turns which leg, left and right, because that was the rule. Afterward, he got a juice box, and he got to pick from a bin, and if he was good, if he didn't tell anybody, because it was a special program and other kids would be jealous, he got $1. "How much money do you have?" Bryan asked. His voice came out normal. He would never know how. Jack thought about it. $41. $41. 41 Tuesdays and Thursdays, and 31 of them had made it into a state database, which meant 10 of them had not. Bryan Galbraith started the truck. He did not drive home. Home was a place with a woman in it, and he was not remotely ready for that conversation, because he had already understood the shape of the thing. The moment he opened his mouth, someone would start moving records. In his trade, there is a word for what happens when you warn a facility before an audit. The word is worthless. You never get a true number twice. He drove to Granville Elementary. It was 4:35. The buses were long gone. The front office was still lit, and the door still buzzed open. And Bryan walked in with his son's jacket over his arm and asked the woman at the desk for a withdrawal form. She said, "A what, hun?" "Withdrawal. Unenrollment. Whatever the form is called when a student leaves the school permanently." She blinked at him. "Are you moving?" "Yes," Bryan said, and it was not true yet, and it became true within the year. Principal Stan Upshaw came out of his office while she was printing it. Upshaw was a heavy, jovial man with a challenge coin on a stand on his desk and a habit of putting a hand on your shoulder. He put a hand on Bryan's shoulder. "Bryan, everything all right?" "Fine. Jack's a good kid. Hey buddy, he's one of our success stories actually." Upshaw laughed at something that was not a joke. "We've got the wellness partnership. You know, we're a pilot site. Been real good for the district. Bryan looked at him for a second and a half. 20 years of walking into facilities had taught him one reliable thing. You can tell whether a man knows what's in his own building by whether he brings it up before you do. Pilot site, Bryan said. That's the health office thing. Sure, free screenings, follow-up, all that. Grant funded. Upshaw beamed. Alder Point runs it. Great, said Bryan. Where's the health office? He's got a jacket in there. He did not have a jacket in there. Bryan was holding his jacket. The health office was down the 6th grade hall, past the fire panel, and Mrs. Deborah Pickering was still in it at 4:40 in the afternoon, which is not a time when a school nurse is in a school. She turned around and saw Bryan Galbraith standing in her doorway, with Jack behind him, and Bryan watched the color go out of her face from the top down, like someone pulling a shade. "Mr. Galbraith," she said. He didn't answer her. He was looking past her, at the curtain, and at the half of the room behind it, and at the small white under-counter refrigerator against the back wall, with a padlock hasp screwed into the door frame. There was a sticker on the side of that refrigerator, green border, white field, 4 handwritten lines, temperature mapping, pass, 9.24 HR, unit #4471, and a signature, and the signature was his. Bryan had validated that fridge. 14 months earlier, on a subcontract, 40 minutes of work, one of 11 small satellite units he had done for a client in a single week, and the client on the work order had been a research site he had never physically visited, and he had been paid $320, and he had hung his own name on the door of the box that held the thing they were putting in his son. Ben Red found him at 9 that night sitting on the floor of their shop with a laptop and every external drive they owned laid out in front of him in a line, parallel to the edge of the bench, which is what Bryan Galbraith did with objects when he was not okay. "Where's Jack?" "My sister's. Lori's got him." "Where's Claudia?" "Calling," Bryan said. 40 times. Ben Red was 47, built like a filing cabinet, and had been Bryan's partner for 9 years, and his friend for longer. He looked at the drives, and at Bryan's face, and he did not ask a single one of the questions a normal person asks. He said, "What are we pulling?" "Everything with Alder Point on it." "Since when?" "Since ever." Here is the thing that Dr. Teresa Nesbitt could not have known when she told a father to build his case out of what was written down. She thought she was giving him a general principle. She was, by pure accident, giving it to the one man in Chancey County who owned the writing. Because a validation firm does not just hand a client a certificate, it keeps the raw data. Federal guidance, client contracts, and Bryan's own stubbornness all said the same thing. The underlying records live with the firm for a minimum of 7 years, and Bryan Galbraith, who had never thrown away a data logger file in his life, had 11 years of them. Every temperature mapping study GNR had run at Alder Point Pediatric Research. Every annual requalification of their investigational product freezer. Every continuous monitoring export from the loggers in that freezer. Because GNR didn't just certify the box. They leased the monitoring system. And the monitoring system phoned home to a server in a closet in Bryan's shop every 90 minutes, and had done since 2019. 4 years of a cold box's private diary. Every door open event, every excursion, every alarm, and every alarm acknowledgement, with the login of the person who had clicked it and the timestamp of when they had. Bryan pulled up the door event log for unit #4471, the little fridge in the school, and filtered it to weekdays, 6 a.m. to 7:59 a.m. The screen filled. Tuesdays, Thursdays, 6:52, 7:04, 6:58, 7:11, 6:47. 14 months of them, because that was as far back as that unit's logger went. "That's a school nurse's office," Ben said slowly. "Opening a locked drug fridge at 10 to 7 in the morning, twice a week, for a year. 14 months, Bryan." Ben sat down on the bucket. "What was in it?" Bryan turned the laptop around and showed him the compound name he'd written on his hand in the truck, copied off a monitor in a pediatrician's office in the 4 seconds he'd had. VT419. Ben Red looked at it for a while. Then he said, "I know that name." "How do you know that name?" "Because we signed a confidentiality agreement about it in 2021, Ben said. "Varick Therapeutics. That's the sponsor. That's the client, Bryan. That's who pays the Alder Point invoices." To understand what had been done to Jack Galbraith, you have to understand a very boring business model. And the fact that it is boring is the entire reason it worked for 9 years. Drug companies do not run their own trials. They rent them. When Varick Therapeutics needed to prove that VT419 was safe in children, they did not build a clinic. They hired a network of small private research sites, storefronts essentially, in strip malls and medical parks in towns like Belvoir, and they paid those sites per enrolled patient, per completed visit, per clean data point delivered on time. The good sites got the next study. The slow sites got nothing, which means that in a small research site, a child is not a patient. A child is a revenue schedule. Dr. Ignatius Ormond understood that arithmetic better than anyone in the state of Indiana. He was 56. He had trained well and started brilliantly. A pediatric endocrinology fellowship at a university everyone has heard of. 3 papers before he was 32. Then he had spent 11 years failing to become the man those papers had promised. He didn't get the chair. He didn't get the grant. He watched people he had tutored get named to things. In 2014, he left academic medicine entirely, took out a loan against a house his second wife had paid for, and opened Alder Point Pediatric Research in a unit between a dialysis center and a vape shop, on the Belvoir bypass. And he found out something that made him laugh out loud alone in his car. He was extraordinary at it. Not at the science, at the enrollment. Enrollment is the bottleneck of the entire pharmaceutical industry. Everybody has a protocol. Nobody has enough children who fit it. A site that can deliver 40 qualifying pediatric subjects in a quarter is worth more to a sponsor than a site with a Nobel laureate in it, and Ormond could deliver 60. He did it by understanding, before almost anyone, that the richest untapped vein of eligible children in America is a public school. The pitch was beautiful, and every word of it was technically defensible. Alder Point would fund a wellness partnership with the district, free vision and hearing screening, free scoliosis checks, a part-time nurse's salary the district didn't have to pay, follow-up for kids whose families would never take a day off work for a specialist appointment. In a district that had cut its art teacher, it read like a gift from heaven, and Principal Stan Upshaw signed it in a meeting that lasted 19 minutes and got a plaque. What the partnership actually did was put an Alder Point employee inside a building containing 410 children with a locked refrigerator, a schedule, and permission to see any of them alone. The screenings generated referrals. The referrals generated abnormal findings. And here is where it stopped being a gray area and became a crime. Because a child with a genuinely abnormal finding is worth a follow-up appointment, while a child with a documented, chartable, protocol-qualifying condition is worth $11,400 over 30 months. Deborah Pickering had been a school nurse for 22 years on $41,000 a year. Alder Point paid her a site coordinator stipend of $2,200 a month, in addition, for doing what she was already in the building doing. She had a daughter at Purdue. She told herself, for 9 years, that she was giving these kids more care than they would otherwise get. And the appalling thing, the thing that made her useful, is that she half believed it. And then there was Claudia. Claudia Galbraith did not need to be recruited. Claudia had volunteered. She had walked into Alder Point in the spring of 2020 to answer an ad for a part-time intake position, and Ignatius Ormond had looked up from a desk and seen a woman with a lot of front-room furniture in her, and not much back-room furniture, which is a type he collected the way Jack collected bottle caps. By that summer, she was doing intake. By that fall, she was in the room where the enrollment targets were on a whiteboard. By that winter, she was in a Hampton Inn in Terre Haute 4 times. And by the following spring, she had understood the single most important fact about the business. Parents were the hard part. Parents asked questions. Parents didn't come back for visit 7, unless the parent worked there. There is a line in every clinical trial protocol about it, buried in the ethics section, and it exists because of exactly this. Site staff enrolling their own children is a conflict so obvious that it barely gets discussed. Ormond discussed it once, with Claudia, in a car, and what he said was, "So we don't put your name on it." Bryan learned all of this over 5 weeks, in pieces, from a laptop, from public court filings, from a state grant portal, from an archived version of a school board meeting agenda, and from a 24-year-old woman named Danica Eastlake who worked in Alder Point's regulatory closet, and who had been waiting 2 years for somebody to ask her a question. But the piece that came first, the piece that came on day 4 and rearranged everything, came from a manila envelope that Dr. Teresa Nesbitt left in the pocket behind the passenger seat of Bryan's truck in a Kroger parking lot without saying a word to him. It was Jack's Alder Point file, or 40 pages of it. The first page was a consent form. Informed consent for participation in a clinical investigation. Varick Therapeutics Protocol, VT419-PED02. Subject, IDB, BLV, 0114. Signature of parent or legal guardian. Line 1. Claudia R. Galbraith. Signature of parent or legal guardian. Line 2. Bryan T. Galbraith. He looked at his own name in his own handwriting for a long, long time in the cab of a truck in a grocery store parking lot. It was good. It was genuinely good. Whoever had done it had worked from something real. The loop on the B was his. The way the T collapsed into the H was his. It was better than the signature he produced when he was tired. Then he looked at the date. The consent was dated the 19th of February. The year was the year before Jack was born. Jack Galbraith had been enrolled in a longitudinal pediatric cohort study 11 weeks before he existed outside his mother. Bryan got out of the truck and walked to the end of the lot and stood by the cart corral for 6 or 7 minutes, because it recategorized everything, every single thing. This was not a woman who had made a terrible decision when the money got tight in 2021. This was a woman who had, at 7 months pregnant, sat in a strip mall office and signed a document putting her unborn child into a birth cohort observational arm, the kind that pays a small stipend per year, for 18 years, for follow-up data. She had sold their son's childhood as a subscription. And when the observational arm ended and the interventional study opened in 2021, the one with an actual compound in it, an actual needle, actual risk, Jack had already been in the database for 9 years with a signed consent on file, which made him, in the language of the industry, a retained subject. The easiest enrollment there is. Bryan drove to Kessel Street that night after close, and Dr. Nesbitt let him in through the same staff door. They sat in the dark waiting room with the fish tank glowing. "I want to know why you did it," Bryan said. "In the room. Why not call somebody? Why not call me the next day like a normal person?" "Because I tried the normal person route," she said, 26 months ago, and I have been paying for it ever since. And she told him about Molly Fothergill. Molly had been 8. Nesbitt had seen her for a sore throat in the winter of the previous year and had found a resting tremor in a child with no reason on earth to have one, plus a heart rate of 51, plus a mother who mentioned in passing that Molly was in the school program. Nesbitt had pulled the same database Bryan had seen and found the same 11 words in the location column. She had done everything right. She filed a report with the Institutional Review Board that oversaw Alder Point's studies. She filed a second report with the State Medical Board. She wrote a letter to Varick Therapeutics Safety Desk. An Institutional Review Board is supposed to be the independent body that protects human subjects. It is supposed to be the wall. The chair of the IRB that oversaw every Alder Point protocol was a physician named Dr. Allison Hume, who had a private consulting agreement with 2 of Varick's other sites, and who had been to Ignatius Ormond's lake house. The IRB reviewed Nesbitt's report in a closed session and determined that the concerns did not meet the threshold for an unanticipated problem. The state board did nothing for 11 months and then closed the file. Varick's safety desk sent a form letter, and 4 months after Nesbitt filed, her practice was audited, not by the board, by an insurer, on a billing pattern anomaly referral, and she spent $19,000 on lawyers and 8 months of nights on records, and at the end of it she was fined $400 for a coding error, and her malpractice premium tripled. "That is how it works," she said. "You don't get sued, you get made expensive." "And Molly?" Dr. Nesbitt was quiet. "Molly Fothergill has a movement disorder," she said. "She's 10 now. She uses a walker on bad days. Nobody will ever be able to prove what caused it, because there is no baseline neurological exam in her file, because the site that would have done it is the site that did this. That's the design, Mr. Galbraith. That is not an accident. You cannot prove harm in a child whose only medical record is written by the people who harmed him. Bryan sat with that. Then he said, "So I need a record they didn't write." And Dr. Teresa Nesbitt looked at him in the dark and said, "Yes, that's exactly what you need. I've been looking for one for 2 years." Bryan said, "Doctor, what's the temperature range on VT419? She didn't understand the question. "I'm sorry? Storage range. What's it stored at? 2 to 8 degrees. Presumably. It's a..." She stopped. "Why?" "Because I own the thermometer," Bryan Galbraith said. The counterattack came 11 days after the checkup, and it was faster and smarter than Bryan had braced for, because he had been thinking about a marriage and they had been thinking about an asset. It opened with Claudia crying on his sister's porch, which he had expected. It escalated to Claudia in a lawyer's conference room, saying the words "medically necessary care," which he had not. The filing was an emergency motion. It said that Bryan Galbraith had unilaterally removed a 10-year-old child from an established course of treatment prescribed by a licensed physician, that he had withdrawn the child from school without the consent of the other parent, that the child had a documented chronic condition requiring ongoing management, and that the father had exhibited escalating fixation and paranoid ideation regarding his son's medical providers. Attached to it were 41 pages of Jack's Alderpoint chart, including a diagnosis Bryan had never heard applied to his son in his life, and a consent form with his own forged signature on it, submitted to a court as proof that he had known and approved all along. That is the part people don't understand about paperwork. A forged signature is not just a lie about the past. It is a weapon aimed at the future. It meant that the second Bryan said, "I never agreed to this," the document said, "Yes, you did." And one of them was a piece of evidence and one of them was a man talking. They also had a doctor, Dr. Melanie Zink, custody evaluator, $300 an hour, who had done work for Orman's attorney's firm 9 times in 4 years, and who conducted a 90-minute interview and wrote that the father presented as rigid, procedural, and emotionally constricted, which is an extremely accurate description of Bryan Galbraith, and an extremely dishonest way to say it. Rebecca Dryden, Bryan's lawyer, read the motion twice, and then set it down and said, "Okay, I want to be straight with you. Today, on this paper, you lose. I know. You understand what an emergency order does. It's temporary, and it's fast, and it's decided by a judge who has 11 minutes and a stack. They have a chart, a diagnosis, a prescriber, and your signature. You have a story about a pediatrician who told you to run out a back door. I know. So the only question that matters," Dryden said, "is what you can put in front of a judge that isn't a story." Then the worst 2 weeks of Bryan Galbraith's life happened, and they had nothing to do with lawyers. Jack got sick. Not dramatically. It started with him being cold all the time, in May, wearing a hoodie in a 70-degree kitchen. Then the headaches. Then a night at Lori's house when Bryan woke up at 2:40 in the morning because he heard his son in the bathroom and found him sitting on the floor by the tub with his hands out in front of him, palms down, watching his own fingers shake, and Jack looked up and said, "Dad, I can't make it stop," in a small, flat voice, and Bryan Galbraith learned what it is to feel your whole chest turn to water. Chancey Memorial had no idea what to do with him. There was no baseline. There were no prior labs except Alderpoint's, and Alderpoint's labs said everything was fine, because Alderpoint's labs were the product being sold. It was Dr. Nesbitt who called a friend who called a friend, and it was a neurologist in Indianapolis named Dr. Wendover, no relation, a coincidence Bryan hated, who finally said the word. Withdrawal. Out loud. And it was that woman who documented, in a hospital record, on hospital letterhead, in a system Ignatius Orman did not own, a 10-year-old boy with a resting tremor, bradycardia, and a 4-year exposure history to an investigational compound his father could not name. That record cost Jack 11 days in a hospital bed. It was also the first sentence of Bryan's case that had not been written by the other side. He did not fight the emergency order. Rebecca Dryden argued it and lost it in 11 minutes exactly as she'd predicted, and Bryan sat there and let it happen. And the order that came down gave Claudia primary custody with a prohibition on the father, interfering with the minor's established medical care. And it was the single most useful thing that happened all year, because Ignatius Ormond read it as a win. A man who thinks he has won stops moving evidence. You're going to let her take him, Ben Red said in the shop that night. He was furious. Bryan. For 9 weeks. 9 weeks. He's not going back in that fridge, Bryan said. The hospital order says he's medically contraindicated for further dosing. Nesbitt made sure of it, and that came from Indianapolis, not from me. They can have the address. They can't have the arm. Ben stared at him. And in 9 weeks, Bryan said. What happens at Alder Point? Ben Red, who had run the sales side of a validation firm for 9 years, worked it out and sat down heavily on the bucket. Annual requalification, he said. July 14th, Bryan said. It's in our contract. It's in their protocol. It's in their standard operating procedure that Varick's auditor signed off on. Every 12 months, the investigational product storage unit gets a 9-point temperature mapping study by an independent contractor. Us, Ben said. They'll cancel it. They can't, said Bryan. That's the whole thing, Ben. That's the entire thing. They can't cancel it, because on July 19th, Varick pays out the interim milestone on VT 419-PED02. $2.4 million to the site network, $460,000 of it to Alder Point, and the milestone package requires a current requalification certificate for IP storage. No certificate, no milestone. And if they fire us and hire somebody else, that somebody else has to map the box in July in Indiana with the compressor that's in it. What's wrong with the compressor? Bryan turned the laptop around. Here is what 4 years of a cold box's private diary had told him, once he sat down and read it like a book instead of a spreadsheet. Alder Point's investigational product freezer, the real one, the big one at the site, unit #3390, was dying. It had been dying since the previous August. It held its set point fine in the middle, and it could not hold the back left corner within range for more than about 9 hours at a stretch once ambient in the building went over 78 degrees. Bryan's 9 probes had recorded it. His monitoring system had recorded it. And the monitoring system had generated 141 excursion alarms since the previous summer. Every single one of them had been acknowledged and cleared, from the site, usually within 4 minutes. 141 times. Log in, I. Ormond. He's been silencing them, Ben said. He's been silencing them, and then he's been signing a monthly temperature log that says no excursions occurred and sending that log to the sponsor in the data package. Bryan's voice was perfectly level. Ben, he's been giving degraded product to children and certifying that he didn't. That's not a custody dispute. That's not even a licensing issue. That's a federal case. That's a federal case, Bryan agreed. And every number in it is on a server in our closet, and it's time-stamped, and it's ours, and he has never once thought about it, because nobody thinks about the thermometer. They came for the server on the 26th of May. Not violently, legally, which is worse. A letter from Alder Point's counsel terminating the monitoring agreement, demanding return of all leased equipment and deletion of all client data, per a confidentiality clause, within 10 business days. Bryan read it and laughed for the first time in 6 weeks. Then he called Rebecca Dryden and had her file a records preservation notice, and then he did the thing that made it stick. He shipped a forensic image of the entire monitoring database, hashed, to a third-party escrow in Chicago, and mailed a printed copy of the hash to himself certified. Because a validation technician's entire religion is that data you can alter isn't data. The rest of the plan took shape over June, and Bryan built it the way he built everything, which is to say he wrote it down and then attacked his own writing until it stopped being wrong. He set himself 3 rules and put them on an index card taped inside a cabinet door in the shop. 1. No lie leaves my mouth. 2. Every fact arrives from someone who has to tell the truth. 3. He does it to himself, in front of people who count. Rule 2 was the hard one, and Rule 2 is why he needed Danica Eastlake. She was 24. She had a bachelor's degree in health sciences and a job title that was 3 words long, and she sat in a windowless room at Alder Point that everybody called the closet, and she was the person who assembled regulatory binders, the stacks of forms that go to the sponsor and the FDA every time anything happens at a research site. Bryan did not approach her. That was the point. Ben Red's wife taught spin at the Y, and Danica Eastlake took the Tuesday class, and it took 11 days to arrange a conversation that looked like an accident. And when it finally happened, in a parking lot, Bryan said exactly one sentence. He said, "I'm not asking you for anything. I want you to know that a boy named Jack is in Chansey Memorial with a tremor, and his subject ID is BLV0114, and if you ever want to look up what you've signed, that's the number." Then he got in his truck and left. She called him 9 days later at 11:40 at night, and the first thing she said was, "There are 14 of them. Not 14 subjects. 14. Staff affiliated. Subjects. 14 children enrolled across 2 protocols who were the children, nieces, nephews, or stepchildren of Alder Point employees, none of whom appeared on any conflict of interest disclosure. And Danica Eastlake, who assembled the binders, knew exactly which form recorded that. Form FDA 3454. Certification. Financial interests and arrangements of clinical investigators. 1 page, 2 checkboxes. The principal investigator signs it under penalty of perjury, and it goes to the sponsor. And the sponsor files it with the agency. And Ignatius Ormond had signed one every year for 9 years. And there was a fresh one due with the July milestone package. Bryan looked at the blank form for a long time. Then he called Special Agent Marcia Haskins at the FDA Office of Criminal Investigations, Chicago Field Office, and said the 12 words that get an investigator to drive 4 hours. "I have 4 years of independent temperature data on a pediatric trial site." On the morning of July 14th, Bryan Galbraith parked a white van in front of Alder Point Pediatric Research at 6:50 a.m. and unloaded 9 calibrated probes, a data logger, a laptop, 2 folding barriers, and a clipboard, exactly as he had done there 4 times before. He wore the polo with the logo on it. He signed the visitor book. He said good morning to the front desk girl and asked if the coffee was the good kind, and she said no, and he said it never is. He was there for 11 hours. That is what a 9-point mapping study is. You place the probes, you seal the box, and you let it run for a full day-night cycle while you sit outside it doing paperwork. There is nothing to watch. That is exactly why nobody ever watches you. Ignatius Ormond came out at 9:15 with 2 coffees. And this is the part where you have to understand that Ormond was not stupid. He was extremely intelligent and completely, structurally certain that every problem in his life was a negotiation he hadn't opened yet. "Bryan," he said, "I've been meaning to reach out. Doctor, this is awkward, and I'd rather just say it. I know about the custody thing. Claudia is an employee, and I've had to be very careful. And I want you to know I've kept a hard wall there." He sat down on the folding chair like a man being generous with his time. "For what it's worth, I think you got railroaded. Family court is a meat grinder." Bryan wrote a number on a form. "Can I ask you something professionally?" Ormond said. "The unit. 3390. Where are we at?" "Second hour of 24. I'll know tonight. Because I'll be honest with you. I think it's tired. It's a 2016 unit. And obviously, if it doesn't requalify, I've got a real problem in the next 4 days." He smiled ruefully. "Sponsor deadline. You know how it is. I know how it is. So here's what I'm thinking. If it comes in marginal, and it might, it's July. I'd want to know whether there's a version of this where we certify the unit and I replace it in September, and GNR does the install and the new mapping. Which is what, $40,000 of work?" Bryan looked up from the clipboard for the first time. "You're asking me to pass a freezer that fails." Ormond didn't flinch. He had done this before. "I'm asking whether there's a range where a professional exercises judgment," he said. "You've been doing this 20 years. You know the difference between a box that's out of tolerance and a box that's actually a risk. Those aren't the same thing, and everybody in this industry knows it, and nobody says it out loud. And if I don't exercise judgment," Ormond drank his coffee, "then I think we're probably not the right long-term partner for GNR," he said pleasantly. "And I think a custody evaluator would be very interested in a father who used a professional contract to harass his son's treating physician. And I think, Bryan, I say this kindly, you don't have another $40,000 of fight in you." Bryan Galbraith said, "Let me think about it." That sentence was the trap closing, and Ormond heard it as a man folding, because a man who is folding sounds exactly like a man who has been waiting 11 weeks to say a specific thing. The unit failed. Of course it failed. Corner 4 and corner 7 went to 9.8 and 10.1 degrees Celsius in the 7th hour and stayed out of range for 4 hours and 11 minutes. And by 6 p.m., the raw dataset on Bryan's laptop was the most beautiful thing he had ever produced. At 7:20 that evening, he called Ormond and said, "It failed. I'm going to write the certificate." There was a pause of about 2 seconds on the line. "Which certificate?" Ormond said. "That's what I want to talk about," said Bryan. "Not on the phone." They met at the site on Wednesday the 16th at 6 p.m., after hours. Bryan asked for $85,000. He asked for it in a way that was very specific, and that he and Special Agent Haskins had spent 2 evenings getting exactly right. He said he could not take it as a payment from Alderpoint, because a payment from a client to a validation contractor would show up in an audit, and it had to route through something that already had a legitimate reason to move money to a Galbraith. He suggested the participant reimbursement account. "Claudia's already drawing on it," he said. "Travel, mileage, whatever it is. Add me as a caregiver on Jack's subject line and run it that way. Nobody looks at reimbursement." He watched Ignatius Ormond think about it for 11 seconds and then say, "That's actually clean. That single sentence. Add me as a caregiver on the subject line and run it through reimbursement." Converted a squalid bribe into a federal offense with 3 separate names. Because the participant reimbursement account at a clinical trial site is funded by the sponsor and audited by the agency, and moving $85,000 through it to buy a false storage certificate is not a business dispute. It is fraud against a federal program, and it is a kickback, and it is a false statement in a matter within the jurisdiction of the United States. And Ormond, who had spent 9 years never touching a needle himself, put it in writing, because that is what a man does when he is certain he is the smartest person in the room, and the room is his own building. The final day was Friday the 18th of July. It was, on paper, the most boring appointment in Chancey County. A scheduled signing of the annual regulatory package for Protocol VT 419, PED 02, requalification certificate, monthly temperature log summary, delegation of authority log, financial disclosure. Danica Eastlake had assembled the binder. That was her job. She had assembled it precisely, correctly, and in the order it was supposed to be in, and she had added nothing and removed nothing, which is why nothing about that binder could ever be attacked. Varick Therapeutics had also, 4 days earlier, notified Alderpoint of a routine sponsor audit. Routine, unremarkable, one of 6 that quarter. And the auditor, a tired woman from Boston with a rolling bag, had been in the site since Wednesday. Bryan arrived at 4 p.m. with a folder under his arm. Ormond met him in the conference room, in a good mood, and slid an envelope across the table with a signed authorization for the reimbursement disbursement in it, and said, "So we're all squared." "We're all squared," Bryan said, and he put his folder down and opened it. The top sheet was a certificate of requalification for unit #3390 with a green pass block on it. Ormond picked it up, glanced at it, and set it in the binder, and reached for his pen. "There's a second copy under it," Bryan said, "for your file." Ormond lifted the sheet. The second sheet was also a certificate for unit #3390, on the same letterhead, with the same unit number and the same date, and the block on it was red, and it said fail, and beneath it were the 11-hour raw traces for corners 4 and 7, and beneath that a single line that read, "Excursion alarms generated by this unit and acknowledged from site login I died Ormond since 08-2023, 141. The conference room door opened. The Varick auditor came in first, with her laptop. Behind her was Special Agent Marcia Haskins, with a second agent, and behind them was Danica Eastlake, holding nothing at all, which she had been told to do. Bryan Galbraith said the only line he had rehearsed. He said, "Doctor, before you sign the disclosure, the one on top of the stack, I want to make sure you've read question 2, because there are 14 children in your studies who belong to your own staff, and one of them is my son, and I have his consent form here, and my signature on it is not mine." Ignatius Ormond looked at the pen in his hand for a very long time. And then, because a man like that cannot stop being the smartest person in the room even when the room has stopped being his, he said, "I want a lawyer," and set the pen down on top of the fail certificate, which meant that the last thing he ever did as principal investigator of VT 419 Ped 02 was decline to sign a form certifying he had no conflicts. It was over in 11 months, which everybody told Bryan was fast. The FDA suspended enrollment at Alder Point on the 22nd of July, and Varick terminated the site 4 days later. And by August, the agency had issued a Form 483 that ran to 19 observations, of which the 7th was the one that mattered. Investigational product was stored. Outside labeled conditions on 141 documented occasions. Monitoring alarms were dismissed, and monthly temperature logs certifying no excursions were submitted to the sponsor. Ignatius Ormond was indicted in the Southern District of Indiana on 26 counts: wire fraud, healthcare fraud, false statements, receipt of an illegal kickback, 2 counts of aggravated identity theft for the forged consent, which carries a mandatory consecutive sentence, and which is the count his attorney fought hardest and lost worst. He pled at the end of the following March and got 132 months. He surrendered his license in the same week, which was, in his own words in the allocution, the part I actually mind. Deborah Pickering cooperated on day 2 and testified for 3 hours about a locked white refrigerator, and got probation, and lost the nursing license she had held for 22 years. Principal Stan Upshaw was not charged with anything, and did not need to be. The district's own review found the partnership agreement had never been read by counsel, and he resigned in October, citing family reasons, and now sells commercial flooring. Dr. Allison Hume, chair of the independent review board that was supposed to be the wall, was removed by her institution and referred to the agency's disqualification proceedings. Her closed session determination from 26 months earlier, the one that found Dr. Nesbitt's report did not meet the threshold, was read aloud in open court, and it is the only part of the whole proceeding that Teresa Nesbitt attended in person. Claudia Galbraith was charged with conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud and with making a false statement, and she pled to the false statement, and she got 14 months. Bryan was asked, once, by Rebecca Dryden, whether he wanted to submit a victim statement about her specifically. He thought about it for 2 days and said no. He said, "She'll have to explain it to him herself someday. That's worse than anything I'd write." The custody case ended in a hearing that lasted 11 minutes, which Bryan appreciated for the symmetry. Full legal and physical custody. The forged consent form was entered as an exhibit, and the judge, a different judge, looked at it for a while, and then looked at Bryan and said, "Mr. Galbraith, I'm going to note for the record that in April this court ordered you not to interfere with your son's medical care, and that you complied with that order." Bryan said, "Yes, Your Honor." "Was that difficult?" "It was the hardest thing I've ever done." "Why did you?" And Bryan Galbraith said, "Because if I'd broken it, we'd be arguing about me." Jack got better slowly and not completely. The tremor is gone, the bradycardia resolved by the following spring. He is 13 now, and there is a fatigue that comes on him some days that 3 neurologists have declined to explain, and there is no way, there will never be a way, to know what 4 years of a compound at 9.8 degrees did or didn't do to a growing boy, because the people who should have measured it were the people doing it. He still collects bottle caps. He has 4,000 of them. He has a spreadsheet. The Fothergills got a settlement from Varick, and so did 9 other families, and so did Jack. And Bryan put every dollar of it in a trust the boy cannot touch until he is 25, and directed the trustee never to invest it in healthcare. Alder Point's assets were auctioned in a parking lot in November. Bryan went. He did not intend to bid on anything, and then he bid, on one lot, and paid $310 for a small white under-counter refrigerator, unit #4471, with a padlock hasp screwed into the door frame, and a green-bordered sticker on the side with his own signature on it. He took it back to the shop and he pulled the sticker off with a razor blade, and then he plugged it in, empty, and put a single calibrated logger inside it, and let it run for 30 days. It held 2.1 to 4.9 degrees the entire month. Ben Red asked him what in God's name that was for. "Nothing," Bryan said. "I just wanted one true number out of it." They left Belvoir in the second week of the following January. There was no dramatic reason. The house sold. Ben bought Bryan out of the Indiana side of the 4. Business and Bryan opened a 2-man shop 3 states away where nobody's mother had done church flowers, and nobody at the grocery store knew what a subject ID was. Dr. Teresa Nesbitt retired the following year at 60. The fish tank went to the man who had serviced it. She sent Jack a card on his 12th birthday and did not mention any of it, and Jack sent one back with a bottle cap taped inside it, which she still has. And on the last morning, loading the truck, Jack asked his father why they were really moving, and Bryan told him the truth, which was that he had gotten tired of driving past buildings. Here is what I keep turning over, and it isn't the villain. Ignatius Ormond is easy. A man who converts children into a revenue schedule is a solved problem. You can see him coming. And when a federal prosecutor gets his own spreadsheets, he loses. And he should. He doesn't teach me anything. What teaches me is the sticker on the side of that refrigerator. Bryan Galbraith's own name, in his own hand, hanging on the door of the box. He did not do anything wrong when he signed it. He mapped the unit. It passed. He certified it. He got paid $320. That is an honest man doing an honest job correctly. And the machine took his signature and used it as a wall between his son and anybody who might have asked a question. That's the thing I want you to sit with. In the world we actually live in, you are not usually attacked. You are cited. Somebody takes a true thing about you. Your name, your job, your diligence, your reputation for being reliable. And they put it in front of the thing they're doing, so that anyone who looks sees you standing there and moves along. So here is the only homework I've ever given at the end of one of these. Sometime this week, find one document with your signature on it that you don't remember signing. A consent, a waiver, an enrollment, a form somebody handed you across a counter while you were holding a child and a car seat and a phone. You will find one. Everybody has 3 or 4. Read it. All of it. Find out what you certified and who is allowed to rely on it. Because the flat line on that growth chart didn't lie, and the freezer didn't lie, and the door sensor didn't lie. The only things in this entire story that lied were the documents written by people with a stake, and the one record that finally broke it open was written by a machine in a closet that nobody thought about, that just sat there in the dark for 4 years, honestly counting. Be the closet. Keep your own numbers. I'm Nathan. Thanks for staying with me on this one.